The story of silence in art begins not with emptiness, but with rebellion. In the early 20th century, Western art was deafening with color, movement, and ideology. The explosive brushwork of Expressionism, the geometries of Cubism, and the bold manifestos of the Futurists filled galleries and salons with noise, both visual and intellectual. Yet amid this crescendo, a quiet countercurrent emerged. Artists and composers began asking, what happens when we remove rather than add? Minimalism's earliest seeds were sown in the ashes of two world wars. The European avant-garde, disillusioned by the chaos of ideology and propaganda, sought purity and reduction. The Dutch Distill movement, led by Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg, sought universal harmony through vertical and horizontal lines, a visual language stripped of excess and emotion. Meanwhile, in post-war Japan, Zen aesthetics and philosophy of Ma, the power of the empty space, shaped the emergence of movements like Monoha, which treated void and form as equals. Across the Atlantic in the 1950s, a new generation of American artists, raised on the existential questions of modernity, began rejecting the heroic splatters of abstract expressionism. Figures like Frank Stella and Agnes Martin sought objectivity, precision, and silence. Stella famously declared, "What you see is what you see." His black paintings, repetitive, austere, self-contained, became manifestos of restraint. Martin's delicate grids, by contrast, breathed with quiet spirituality, merging the rigor of geometry with the serenity of meditation. Minimalism was not just a style. It was a reaction, a cultural immune response to the excesses of both politics and art. In psychology, this parallels what later studies would call stimulus fatigue, the human tendency to seek simplicity when overstimulated. The sociologist Georg Simmel described the blasé attitude of modern life in 1903, an overload of impressions leading to numbness. Minimalism, in this sense, became a form of healing, a way to rediscover perception through the removal of noise. And yet, beneath its quiet surfaces, silence carried tension. As philosopher Susan Sontag noted, silence remains, inescapably, a form of speech. The early minimalists were not escaping the world, but confronting it, through restraint, through absence, through the audacity of doing less. By the 1960s, this quiet revolution would erupt into a full-blown language of form, space, and perception, a language that would redefine not only art but architecture, music, and even our understanding of consciousness itself. If the visual art sought silence through form, music found it through the literal absence of sound. The composer John Cage, often described as a philosopher of the unheard, detonated a cultural bomb in 1952 with his composition 433. In it, the performer sits at the piano and plays nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The music is whatever the audience hears, the rustle of programs, the hum of the ventilation system, the nervous cough of a spectator. Cage turns silence into an instrument, forcing listeners to confront the presence of the world itself. This radical idea did not emerge from nowhere. Cage's work was deeply influenced by Zen Buddhism and the writings of D.T. Suzuki, who taught that silence is not emptiness but awareness. In Zen, the absence of sound is not void but fullness, the fertile space in which perception awakens. Cage applied this to Western music, arguing that composition should not impose structure but reveal what already exists. His ideas would ripple across generations of composers, from La Monte Young to Steve Reich and Philip Glass, who transformed repetition, phase shifting, and gradual change into hypnotic experiences. Minimalist music, often described as process music, relied on psychoacoustic phenomena, the way the human brain perceives patterns, rhythms, and time. Reich's piano phase from 1967, for example, uses two pianos playing the same short phrase that slowly drift out of sync. The listener's mind becomes a real performer, constructing patterns from imperceptible shifts. Glass, meanwhile, translated this meditative repetition into emotional transcendence in works like Einstein on the Beach from 1976, merging structure and spirituality. Neuroscientific research later supported what these composers intuited. Repetition and simplicity can induce theta brainwave states, similar to meditation or flow. In a world increasingly overwhelmed by sensory overload, minimalist music offered cognitive refuge. As media theorist Marshall McLuhan would later observe, the environment itself has become information. In such an environment, silence was not absence, it was rebellion. This redefinition of sound and silence also found resonance in philosophy. The phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized perception as an embodied act. Cage's work literalized that principle by turning listening into an act of awareness. Similarly, the post-structuralist thinkers of the 1960s, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, would dismantle the notion of fixed meaning, aligning with Cage's conviction that art is a field of potential, not prescription. The influence of musical minimalism soon spilled into visual and architectural realms. The rhythmic repetitions of Reich and Glass found their visual analogues in the serial sculptures of Donald Judd and Sol LeWitt, while the temporal spaciousness of Cage's silence echoed in the architectural restraint of Tadao Ando, whose concrete structures balance light and void like sustained notes in air. Minimalism, by this stage, had become more than a movement. It had become a way of perceiving. It reprogrammed how we experience time, space, and meaning. It challenged a modern obsession with progress and productivity, inviting us to pause, to listen, and to see. In the age of acceleration, silence became the most radical act of all. When silence moved from the canvas and the score into the physical world, it became architecture. Nowhere did minimalism's philosophy materialize more powerfully than in the buildings of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Tadao Ando, and John Pawson, architects who turned emptiness into an aesthetic and restraint into a moral code. Mies's aphorism, less is more, one to provocation, became the central dogma of the modernist creed. His Barcelona pavilion from 1929, an arrangement of glass, onyx, and travertine, redefined space not as enclosure, but as flow. There, silence was not absence, but transparency, light, and precision. The Japanese architect Tadao Ando, drawing from Zen Buddhism and the Japanese notion of shibui, which means understated elegance, went further. His Church of the Light from 1989 slices illumination through concrete like a spiritual incision. For Ando, the void is sacred, a place where light performs as architecture itself. This approach echoes phenomenology and philosophy, the study of perception as lived experience. Just as Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that perception is the ground of all knowledge, Ando builds spaces that are felt before they are seen. The psychological dimension of minimalist architecture has been studied extensively. Research by Colin Ellerden and Sussman on neuroarchitecture shows how simplicity and symmetry in built environments lower cortisol levels and induce calm. These findings confirm what the modernists intuitively sensed. Minimalism is not just visual purity. It's a cognitive bomb. In a chaotic urban world, space stripped to its essence functions as therapy. Yet this architectural silence is not neutral. Critics like Robert Venturi challenge its austerity, claiming that the less is more ethic risks sterility and elitism. His counter motto, less is a bore, reintroduce complexity, ornament, and play. But perhaps that tension between silence and expression is precisely the point. Minimalism's architecture doesn't seek to please. It seeks to awaken. It invites you to hear your own footsteps, feel your own breath, and rediscover profound human dialogue between space and self. By the 1960s, minimalism had become a visual language of its own, a deliberate rejection of emotion, representation, and illusion. Artists like Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Sol LeWitt, and Robert Morris dismantled centuries of artistic tradition by stripping art down to its raw materials. A cube was no longer a symbol. It was simply a cube. Judd called his works specific objects, autonomous entities that existed outside of metaphor, beyond narrative. This conceptual shift paralleled broader transformations in 20th century thought. The structuralists and post-structuralists, thinkers like Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida, were questioning meaning itself. If language and culture are systems of difference, then art, too, could operate as pure structure. The minimalist grid became a visual equivalent of deconstruction, the breakdown of hierarchy, narrative, and illusion. Technically, the minimalist visual field engages what cognitive scientists call perceptual reduction, a neurological process in which the brain amplifies subtle contrasts when stimuli are scarce. Neuroscientist Anjan Chatterjee's work on neuroaesthetics reveals that minimal compositions activate the brain's default mode network, associated with introspection and spatial awareness. Minimal art, in other words, invites the viewer into meditation, a dialogue between perception and nothingness. But the minimalist revolution was also deeply political. The industrial materials, steel, plexiglass, fluorescent light, mirrored the rise of Fordism and post-war mass production. The repetition of form reflected both the machine age and a critique of it. In an ironic twist, minimalism's austerity became a commentary on consumer excess. And as art turned toward experience rather than object, museums became laboratories of silence. Standing in front of Judd or a flavoured installation, one's awareness shifts from the artwork to the act of seeing itself. The viewer becomes participant, the gallery becomes stage, and meaning dissolves into pure presence. In the end, the minimalist eye taught us that art's greatest power lies not in what it shows, but in what it withholds. What happens to the human mind when faced with silence, simplicity, and stillness? In an age of infinite noise, the minimalist impulse resonates as both aesthetic and survival mechanism. Psychologists like Daniel Kahneman and Steven Pinker have long explored how the brain handles complexity. Our cognitive load theory suggests that the human mind has limited bandwidth, and that overload leads to anxiety, fatigue, and decision paralysis. Minimalism, by contrast, reduces stimuli, allowing the brain to reallocate attention and restore balance. Neuroscientific studies confirm this effect. Research at Harvard Center for the Developing Child shows that environments with low sensory clutter promote higher focus and emotional regulation. In architecture, Tadao Ando's interplay of void and light triggers meditative brain states, similar to those observed during mindfulness. In music, Steve Reich's phase repetitions synchronize neural oscillations, producing measurable patterns of relaxation. Silence, it turns out, is neurologically active. The auditory cortex remains alert, searching for meaning in absence. The sociological dimension of this is equally striking. The anthropologist Edward T. Hall described how Western societies equate silence with discomfort, while Eastern traditions see it as respect or insight. The growing global fascination with minimalism, from Marie Kondo's decluttering to digital detox movements, reflects an unconscious yearning for control in an age of hyperstimulation. Sociologist Sherry Tickle calls this the reclaiming of conversation, the rediscovery of presence in an attention economy that monetizes distraction. Yet minimalism psychology also reveals its paradox. When silence becomes aestheticized, when simplicity becomes luxury, it risks turning rebellion into branding. The minimalist home, once an antidote to excess, now adorns the pages of high-end design magazines. In consumer culture, even emptiness has a price. Still, at its core, minimalism offers a form of cognitive liberation. It teaches the modern mind to filter, to pause, to perceive again. In a world addicted to immediacy, silence is not withdrawal. It is resistance. It's a return to the fundamental human need for meaning through emptiness, rhythm, and space. Minimalism escaped the museum. What began as an avant-garde rebellion in art, architecture, and music quietly infiltrated the rhythms of daily life, shaping the homes we live in, the clothes we wear, even the interfaces we touch. By the late 20th century, the minimalist aesthetic had become the visual grammar of modernity. Its surfaces, white, open, balanced, whisper of calm amid chaos. Yet behind that serenity lies a deep psychological, economic, and philosophical transformation. The global migration of minimalism into lifestyle and consumer design can be traced through figures like Dieter Rams, the legendary Braun designer whose 10 principles of good design influenced everything from IKEA furniture to the iPhone in your pocket. Rams' dictum, "Good design is as little design as possible," became a credo for Johnny Ive at Apple, whose sleek, buttonless forms turned Bauhaus purity into billion-dollar appeal. These products were not just tools. They were metaphors for mental clarity in an age of information noise. This transition coincided with the rise of digital minimalism, a term popularized by computer scientist Cal Newport, describing a disciplined approach to technology that emphasizes intentionality over addiction. Neurological research supports this cultural drift. Studies at Stanford Media Lab show that excessive digital multitasking fragments attention, lowering working memory capacity and increasing stress markers like cortisol. Minimalist design, from clean user interfaces to decluttered screens, thus became a visual therapy for cognitive fatigue of the information age. But there is also a moral and ecological dimension. Minimalism's focus on reduction aligns with the principles of sustainable consumption. Sociologists like Kate Fletcher and Juliet Shore have analyzed how voluntary simplicity movements in the 1990s reframed consumption as ethical restraint, a rebellion against what Shore called the overspent American. The minimalist aesthetic, once radical, evolved into a new kind of virtue signaling, a visual language of responsibility and restraint. Yet the paradox is impossible to ignore. The global market for minimalist design, from Muji to Scandinavian furniture brands, has commodified simplicity itself. Anthropologist Daniel Miller describes this as the materiality of immateriality. Even anti-consumerism becomes consumer choice. The minimalist apartment, with its hidden storage and neutral palette, is as curated and expensive as the opulent spaces it rejects. Still, within this tension lies meaning. The minimalist wave teaches us something profound about 21st century psychology. We crave emptiness not because we are shallow, but because we are overloaded. Sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls this social acceleration, the sense that time itself has become scarce. In such a world, to slow down, to own less, to quiet the visual field, becomes an act of defiance. Minimalism is no longer just an artistic movement. It's a philosophy of resistance, a silent refusal to be drowned in the noise of modernity. But what happens when subtraction goes too far? Critics of minimalism argue that its purity can curdle into emptiness. An aesthetic so sanitized erases warmth, culture, and complexity. In the 1970s and 1980s, postmodernists like Robert Venturi and Charles Jenks rebelled against the white cube of minimal architecture, arguing that human beings need symbolism, ornament, and narrative. Venturi's counterproclamation, "Less is a bore," became the rallying cry of the new pluralism. Psychologists echo this critique. Studies from the University of Helsinki suggest that excessively sterile environments, though visually calm, can provoke alienation and emotional flatness, a condition sometimes called aesthetic deprivation. What was once liberation can feel, over time, like exile. In art, this reaction birthed new movements. Installation art, neo-expressionism, and later post-minimalism, where artists like Eva Hesse and Richard Serra reintroduced texture, imperfection, and human vulnerability. Minimalism also faces a social critique. Its celebration of space and simplicity presumes privilege, that one owns enough to choose absence. For the working poor or the displaced, living with less is not a design choice but a reality. Cultural theorists like Hal Foster have warned that when minimalism becomes luxury branding, it loses its ethical edge and turns a language of restraint into an aesthetic of exclusion. Thus the paradox deepens. Minimalism's silence, once a rebellion against excess, risks becoming its mirror, a quiet that forgets to listen. What then remains of minimalism when the galleries are emptied and the slogans fade? Perhaps what endures is not the style, but the sensibility, a way of seeing the world through restraint, awareness, and renewal. Across a century of turbulence, minimalism has taught us to notice the intervals between things, the pause in a symphony, the space between walls, the stillness between words. Philosophically, minimalism points back to the phenomenological insight of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. That being is revealed through presence, and presence through attention. Neuroscientific research now mirrors this idea. MRI studies on mindfulness, such as those led by Judson Brewer at Brown University, show how intentional stillness reshapes neural connectivity, strengthening regions tied to empathy and focus. Silence, in this sense, becomes not the absence of thought, but its purification. In an age of algorithmic distraction, this is revolutionary. Minimalism invites us to re-inhabit our own consciousness, to reclaim perception from automation. It reminds us that creativity, spirituality, and love all emerge not from noise, but from rhythm, pattern, and pause. As Brian Eno once said, silence is the canvas of sound. By the end of this journey, one truth becomes clear. The art of silence is the art of being human. Minimalism, born from crisis and contradiction, is not about emptiness at all. It's about tolerance for stillness, a radical patience with what is. It asks us to look again, to listen again, to be present enough to feel the beauty of nothing. And perhaps, in that nothing lies everything.